episode 89, titled Pivoting Concepts, we treat pivoting as the idea of extending your reach through a system you already control, rather than trying to force access directly from where you started. Once you have a foothold, that foothold can become more than evidence of compromise. It can become a bridge into places that are otherwise unreachable. Pivoting is important because networks are designed to limit direct paths, and segmentation often blocks traffic from an external tester location even when internal systems can talk freely to each other. The purpose is not to wander, but to validate what exposure exists behind those boundaries under authorized conditions. When you understand pivoting as controlled reach extension, you can use it to prove impact responsibly while keeping your actions minimal and well documented. Pivoting, simply described, is using one host as a stepping stone to reach other systems. The stepping stone is the foothold you control, such as a compromised workstation, a server session, or a host where you have execution capability within scope. Instead of interacting with targets from your original position, you route or relay your interactions through the foothold, effectively changing your vantage point to inside the environment. This matters because many services are not exposed externally, but they are available internally, and attackers routinely exploit that difference. Pivoting does not automatically mean deeper compromise. It often starts as a connectivity and visibility technique that lets you see what the foothold can reach. When used responsibly, pivoting is a way to test internal exposure without expanding beyond what is justified and authorized. The reason pivoting is needed is that segmentation often blocks direct access from your location, even when the environment contains internal pathways that are wide open. From a tester's starting point, you may not be able to reach management networks, internal-only web applications, or administration interfaces because firewalls and routing rules prevent it. Meanwhile, a compromised internal host may already have reach into those segments as part of its normal operational role, such as a workstation that can reach file shares, printers, and internal web portals. Attackers exploit this by moving their vantage point from outside to inside, then using the internal connectivity to access services that were never meant to be internet-facing. For Pentest Plus reasoning, the important mental shift is that not reachable from here does not mean not reachable, and pivoting is the method that tests that truth. When you see segmentation, you should also look for what trust and routing exist behind it. Common pivot goals are reaching internal services and validating hidden exposure that is not visible from your original position. Internal services might include administrative panels, internal APIs, monitoring dashboards, or legacy applications that are assumed to be safe because they are behind the firewall. Pivoting allows you to determine whether those services are actually protected by strong authentication and authorization or merely protected by location. Another goal is to validate whether sensitive systems are reachable from low-trust endpoints, such as whether a standard workstation can reach an internal administration interface that should be restricted to a management segment. Pivoting can also help confirm whether segmentation is enforced consistently, because inconsistent rules often create unexpected paths. The key is that pivoting should increase certainty about internal exposure, not just increase activity. When a pivot reveals a reachable critical service, it can reframe a finding from theoretical to demonstrable. It helps to distinguish pivoting from lateral movement because the two are related but not identical in intent. Lateral movement is the act of reaching and accessing another system, typically with the goal of establishing presence or capability there. Pivoting is the enabler that changes your access paths, letting you reach targets through a controlled system even if you are not yet moving your foothold to those targets. In other words, pivoting is about how you connect, while lateral movement is about where you end up with access. You can pivot to test reachability and validate exposure without fully moving into the target system, which can be safer and more aligned with scope limits. Conversely, you might move laterally without a formal pivot if you can access the next system directly. Keeping these concepts separate helps you choose the least invasive method that still proves the objective.
Pivoting carries risks because it increases complexity, and complexity is where mistakes and unintended consequences tend to happen. Routing or relaying traffic through an internal host can create accidental exposure if configurations are sloppy, or if you unintentionally make internal services accessible in ways they were not before. It can also create stability concerns because the foothold host may be fragile or heavily used, and additional network activity can impact performance or trigger monitoring responses. Complexity also increases the chance you lose track of what paths were used, what was touched, and what evidence supports the conclusion, which undermines defensibility. Another risk is that pivoting can tempt testers to overreach, because once internal connectivity is available, it can feel like everything is possible, even when scope boundaries prohibit certain segments. A professional pivot plan emphasizes minimal change, careful documentation, and strict adherence to authorization.
Now consider a scenario where your foothold can reach an internal admin interface that you cannot access from your original location. You might have a compromised workstation on a user network, and from that system, you discover that a web-based administration portal responds on an internal address. From outside, that portal is invisible, and the organization might treat it as inherently safe because it is internal only. Through the foothold, you can observe that the interface is reachable, and you can assess whether it enforces authentication, uses strong access controls, and limits exposure appropriately. The point of the scenario is not to take over the portal, but to validate whether internal exposure is relying on segmentation alone. If the portal accepts weak authentication or reveals sensitive information prior to login, the risk becomes immediate and concrete. This is a common pivot outcome, revealing that internal only is not a security control by itself. Safe validation in a pivot scenario means confirming routing possibilities and respecting scope boundaries while keeping the testing footprint small. You want to show that the foothold can reach the target service and that the service behaves in a way that creates or does not create meaningful risk, but you do not want to interact in ways that disrupt operations or cross into forbidden networks. A responsible approach focuses on confirming connectivity, identifying the service, and observing access controls, while avoiding actions that would alter configurations, trigger unsafe automation, or generate broad scanning activity. It also includes documenting the exact path because the value of pivoting evidence comes from showing why the service was reachable from the foothold and why that matters. If authorization is limited, you may be able to validate reachability and basic exposure without attempting full authentication or deeper interaction. The guiding principle is to prove the claim with the least invasive steps possible.
A common pitfall is pivoting without documenting paths, because without a clear description of the route and prerequisites, the finding becomes hard to reproduce and easy to dispute. If you cannot explain which host served as the pivot, what connectivity it had, and why that connectivity existed, stakeholders may treat the result as an artifact of testing rather than a real exposure. Another pitfall is overreaching into forbidden networks, such as drifting from authorized internal segments into regulated environments or critical OT networks because the pivot made them reachable. Scope boundaries still apply even when the network path exists, and reachability does not equal permission. It is also easy to introduce noise by attempting broad internal discovery once pivoting is established, which can create disruption and blur the line between controlled validation and uncontrolled exploration. The professional posture is to treat pivoting as a scalpel, not a floodlight.
Quick wins in pivoting come from using it only when it increases certainty or impact rather than treating it as a default step. If you already have sufficient evidence of risk in the current context, pivoting may add complexity without improving the report. If pivoting is the only practical way to validate whether a hidden internal service is exposed, then it can be justified as a focused action with clear value. A good quick win mindset is to define what you expect to learn from the pivot before you do it, such as confirming that a management interface is reachable from a low trust segment or that segmentation does not restrict access as assumed. When the pivot answers that question clearly, you stop, document, and move back to analysis. This approach keeps the pivot purposeful and minimizes the chance of accidental spillover. From a defensive view, pivot points are important signals because they indicate where segmentation assumptions might fail and where monitoring needs to be stronger. If a low-trust endpoint can reach high-value internal services, defenders should ask whether that reach is necessary and, if it is, what compensating controls exist to prevent abuse. Pivoting also highlights the importance of monitoring east-west traffic because internal movement often happens laterally inside the network rather than through internet-facing boundaries. Defenders should focus on unusual internal routing, atypical connections from endpoints to administrative interfaces, and authentication attempts that occur from unexpected network zones. The presence of a pivot-capable foothold does not automatically mean compromise, but it does mean the network design allows certain paths that attackers can exploit. When defenders understand pivot logic, they can harden segmentation, tighten access controls, and improve detection where it will actually matter. Reporting language for pivoting should clearly show why pivoting mattered and what it enabled, without getting lost in unnecessary detail. A strong report describes the starting limitation, such as the target service being unreachable from the tester's location, and then explains that the foothold host had internal reach that changed the effective access path. It states what service became reachable, what was observed about its exposure and access controls, and what risk that implies if an attacker gains a similar foothold. It also documents the prerequisites, such as the network position of the pivot host and the allowed connectivity that made the path possible, because those details guide remediation. The report should connect pivoting to control gaps, such as reliance on segmentation alone or insufficient authentication on internal services. When written well, pivoting findings become actionable improvements to segmentation and internal service hardening rather than a confusing story about tunneling. A memory phrase helps keep pivoting disciplined. Foothold, root, reach, validate, document. Foothold reminds you that pivoting depends on a controlled system and that the properties of that system determine what is possible. Root keeps your attention on paths because pivoting is fundamentally about changing network vantage points and using internal connectivity. Reach focuses on what becomes accessible and whether that access changes the risk landscape in a meaningful way. Validate emphasizes that you are proving a claim with minimal, controlled interaction, not exploring for its own sake. Document ensures the result is defensible and useful because without documentation, pivoting becomes a story without evidence. As we conclude episode 89, pivoting should feel like a practical concept rather than an advanced trick. It is simply extending reach through a system you control to validate internal exposure that segmentation hides from your original vantage point. A clear pivot use case is when an internal-only administration portal cannot be reached externally, but a compromised workstation can reach it because of its network position and allowed connectivity. By using the workstation as a stepping stone, you can confirm the portal is reachable from a low-trust zone and assess whether it relies on location alone or enforces strong authentication and access control. That narrative is both technically accurate and professionally bounded because it shows why pivoting mattered and what it enabled without requiring reckless expansion. When you can explain pivoting this way, you demonstrate the logic Pen Test Plus expects: purposeful reach extension, controlled validation, and clear reporting that helps defenders fix the underlying trust and segmentation issues. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.